Hey, this is Doug C. Brown with the CEO Sales Strategies Podcast. I got a great guest. It's Mr. Daniel Pink. You can check out his website at danpink.com. Dan is a really smart guy. I mean, he is a world-renowned author. He's got 5 New York Times best-selling books. One of my favorite books out there is called To Sell is Human. And Dan and I are going to talk about how, I would say, the new order of sales that are coming in. In other words, if you're still acting and still on the timeline of what you were selling and how you were selling even 10 years ago, things have shifted so much, especially in the B2B sales world. And if you think and act like you were 10 years ago, then you're probably not getting as great results as you will if you think and act in the new manner of what we're going to talk about, because information asymmetry is kicked in, which means that the buyer now has more information probably about you, your company, and your products and offering, as well as all the competitors before they even talk to you. So we've got to go into a couple of different structured processes in that. And Dan and I are going to dive deep into that. So without further ado, let's go speak to Mr. Dan Pink. Hey, Dan, thanks for being here on the CEO Sales Strategies Podcast and welcome.
Thank you for having me. Good to be with you, Doug.
Yeah. So for those of you who are wondering, man, I've heard this name, but I can't quite place it. Just think New York Best Time, 5-time. I think you have 5 books on the New York Best Time, the bestsellers list on there, total of 7 books. So you want to kind of set the frame, tell people, where you came from, what you're doing now. And
okay. So where I came from. So I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. I went to college. I went to law school. I decided not to practice law. I ended up working in politics for a while as a political speechwriter, decided that I did not want to work in politics at all. And I left that and discovered that what I really wanted to do, and this is now in my early 30s, is be a writer. And so I went out on my own to try to make it as a writer, writing basically what I wanted to cover, the things I wanted to cover, which is a mix of science, technology, business, human performance, human behavior. And that's what I've been doing for the last 20-ish years, writing books on a variety of topics, from changes in the labor market, putting a premium on a different set of skills, to the science of motivation, to sales and persuasion, to the science of timing, to the misunderstood emotion of regret, and so on.
And you wrote my all-time favorite book, which is called To Sell is Human.
Thanks.
And that book, when I read it, I was like, yes, finally somebody understands sales, right? It's we're born to sell, and we're selling from the beginning. And so on the CEO Sales Strategies Podcast, we talk about the 1% earner a lot. How do people actually become that salesperson? And a lot of times I tell people this, Dan, it's like, be yourself. You were born to be this. And I always feel, and I'd love to get your feedback on this, I feel that children are the best salespeople in the world, really, when it comes down to it, as far as like a natural salesperson. They say what they want. They talk about it. They convey it. They're very persuasive. They don't quit most of the time, when they get a no. I'd love to get your feedback. I mean, from a guy who's studied all of this, what do you think?
Sure. I do think that your insight into human nature is exactly right. That human beings we have an innate ability, innate capacity, an innate need to sell, persuade, influence. That is how we have survived. And I think what's happened in the last few years is that there have been some changes in the external environment that have made that natural capacity even more important and forced it to operate in a different way. And so what I mean by that is this: there are a lot of smarty pants out there who look down on sales. And I think that the reason they look down on sales is that they think about sales, they have an old-fashioned notion of sales where the seller always had more information than the buyer. The buyer didn't have many choices. The buyer didn't have a way to talk back. It was a world of information asymmetry. Now that world is disappearing very, very quickly, if not fully. And so we're in a completely different world, and it requires a different set of skills. And yet, when you look at what people do all day on the job, a huge portion of it is sales. And so if there's a kind of two catalytic big ideas in that book you mentioned, it's this. Number one, we are selling all the time. We're all in sales now, whether we like it or not. Two, we're doing it on a remade terrain. It's not a world of information asymmetry. It's a world of information parity. And that requires a different approach. And this is, I think, in some ways, even more sharply presented in B2B than in B2C.
Yeah. And so I have a question on that, because things have changed over the years. I mean, I've been in sales for, I hate to say this, over 50 years now, right? I've been selling for over 50 years. And back when I started, there was no thing called the internet, right? It was, and so I remember when dial-up came in and then DSL came in. For those of you who don't know what that is your first digital line that basically ever came into play. And I remember going to people and going, this is awesome. This is going to change sales forever. And people are like, you're crazy. It's like, you can get information. I'm like, think about this. You now know more than the car dealer. You can go in and figure out right? And so when I was reading through a lot of your material, I was like, man, this guy gets it, right? And so let's cue in on the second part, like how sales has changed for people, especially in the B2B markets now, where there's that information asymmetry that's going on, where the buyer now, sales is it's an extension now of sort of the search process, where before it was like we relied on that salesperson to be the expert. So how do you think that's going to continue to run in the future, especially now with AI and everything that's coming through?
I mean, it's a lot of really interesting questions. A lot of really interesting questions packed in there. Let's just really isolate the change, okay? And it's a big change, and it's in B2B and in B2C. But let me just double click on this idea of information asymmetry. For most of human civilization, we were in a world of information asymmetry. All right. When it comes to buying and selling, when it comes to persuasion more broadly, that is almost every commercial transaction. In every commercial transaction, the seller had more information than the buyer. You could be out, 5,000 years ago selling a goat to another dude for, stones. And the guy selling the goat knew more about goats in general and that goat in particular than the guy buying the goat. Okay. Information asymmetry. That's what gave us the world of buyer beware. Okay. Buyers have to beware because the sellers have more information. And this, Doug, it is really important to note this. This continued for thousands of years. Yeah. Right. It's not a 20th century phenomenon. It's not even a phenomenon only of this millennium. It is a fundamental change in this. So anyway, this arrangement went on for a very, very long time, literally thousands of years. Okay. Then like 10 years ago, as you were describing, it all changed. And so we've gone from this world where sellers of anything had lots of information, lots of choices. Where sellers had where buyers had not much information, not many choices, and no way to talk back. Right. That last point is very important. To a world now where they have as much, if not more information than the seller, lots of choices, and all kinds of ways to talk back. That's not a world of buyer beware. That's a world of seller beware. So now the sellers are on notice. And so what this requires is that you can't take that low road. And you have to actually approach your work in a fundamentally different way. And so to move to B2B for a moment, when you think about B2B sales, my view is that B2B sales is essentially now a form of management consulting. I don't even know why we're calling it B2B sales anymore when it's essentially management consulting. In the old days, when you as a B2B seller had all the information and the buyer had to come to you to get the information, that's a different world. But now all that information is liberated. And so there are all kinds of really interesting consequences of that. Among them, I mean, a more sort of smaller tactical consequence that you alluded to is that buyers, let's stick with B2B. Buyers are coming into the sales process way later in the game.
Yep.
All right. If we think about it from the first sparkle of interest is at a timeline of 1 and the end of the deal is 100, buyers used to come in at like 7 or 8, 9 or 10, like down there. Now they're coming in at 60, 70. I mean, it's totally different. And so as a B2B seller, you have two options. Number one, you can try to complain about this and hold off the inevitable, bad idea, or you can adapt to it and deploy, I think, a set of skills that are fundamentally human and also more sophisticated and I think more interesting as a job.
I agree 100% with what you just said. And so I want to go to the management consulting thing that you were talking about, because so many people in selling today don't get it. And I explain it to them like, look, the buyer has a problem. The buyer has an opportunity. That's really what they're seeking, a resolution to something like that. So if we come in as a seller today and we're like, oh, well, let me tell you about my company. Let me tell you about why we're great, why this is great, why they don't care. They've got a problem. They got an opportunity. They're looking for something that has a business return on investment and personal return on investment in the same conversation. And so things like innovation and, how to help people more so, which is really kind of the consulting model, right? Consultants come in and they solve problems, or so how, like, if we had a weight today, like sales skills, old traditional sales skills, like let's go back to the old sales trainer methodology, to the management consulting side now, how much is that, like, percentage wise now toward the management consultant side, do you feel?
I think especially as you go higher up the ranks of B2B sales, that is, as the product or service you're selling becomes more sophisticated and more expensive, yeah. I think it's going to 80-90% toward management consulting. And to answer the part of your question about what are the different skills, I think there are two really, really important things here, two kind of big categories of things for B2B sales. Number one of them is that, let's go back to the world where the B2B seller had more information about computer systems or CRM software or whatever, right? And the only way to know that was to go to, all right? In that world, you were, the premium you had as a salesperson was you had access to information that nobody else had, right? Today, there is not an access problem on the part of the buyers. The buyers can access that information. They can access almost, not entirely, but almost as much information as you as a seller. So you don't have a comparative advantage by accessing information. You have a comparative advantage by curating information, because that buyer now is overwhelmed with information. That buyer is being inundated with information. And you as the seller have to come in as the expert. And what do experts do? They curate information. Their prospect, their potential buyer has a welter of information. You got to be able to go to them and say, you know what? That's actually useful information. That doesn't really make any sense. That's worth paying attention to. That's not worth paying attention to. All right. So that's what expertise is. And this is a very important point. There's a premium on expertise, but expertise is not having the password to the database that no one else has. Expertise is having the ability to take this huge amount of information that is a blizzard in front of us and make sense of it. The second thing is that it used to be, and this is so true in B2B, that sellers were primarily problem solvers, right? Today, and this is jarring for people, today, problem solving is becoming less important. And the reason for that is that if the potential buyer knows precisely what its problem is, they don't need you very much.
Right.
They need you in B2B to be one of 2 or 3 bidders to drive down the price, but they don't need you very much. Where they need you sometimes desperately is when they don't know what their problem is, or they're wrong about their problem, as is often the case. And so the premium has shifted from problem solving to problem finding. Can you identify hidden problems? Can you surface latent problems? Can you look around the corner and see problems that haven't emerged yet? And those are so curating information and finding problems are 2 profoundly different skills. I mean, they're very sophisticated skills. And the salespeople who master those skills are going to flourish. And the ones who think that it's all about simply having the information and doing a slick presentation and patting people on the back, those folks are going to be goners.
Yeah, that's we're speaking, Mr. Daniel Pink. You're bringing the A game, so thank you. I appreciate this. It's so let's talk about. So, all right, content curator of information. I've got to know and be the expert in my field, not only in what we do, but in everything that touches every sense of my buyer. That accurate?
I'll see you and raise you a bit. I'm gonna raise you just a tiny bit. All right. I think that is true. I 100% agree with what you're saying. I'm going to add I'm going to put in one chip to raise you here. And it's this, that you as a seller, you actually have to know the buyer's business as well as the buyer, him or herself. And this is where it comes to management consultant, that you need to know what that business is, what its pain points are. And you have to be essentially an expert in that business. And know it in some ways almost as well as the people running the business themselves. And at some level, you have a chance to understand that business better because you're less enmeshed in the day-to-day, and you can take an outside perspective and look at it with fresh eyes. You can look at it from a big picture.
So I love
expertise, man. Expertise in curating information, finding problems. That's what it means to be an expert today.
And so I love the fact that we're using poker analogy. So I'm going to throw another chip back in and raise it up again. And I want to get your feedback on this. I firmly agree. And this is something that people don't want to do because it's like, I got to research things hard. And it's like, too bad, get out of selling. You know what I mean? Like, because you're going to get steamrolled by your competitors, the ones who are doing this. I also think, and I want your feedback on this, please, is we must understand the business side of the business so well, but we also now have to really understand the buyer positioning. Like if I'm the CEO, the CHO, or the IT guy or whatever, we want to know what they're thinking, how it affects their job performance and their personal performance in addition. Would you agree or disagree with that one?
I agree with that. Absolutely. I'm not going to raise that because I think you're at the top of the game here, though. I think that's exactly right. It's another dimension of that, and it's something it's actually even harder in some ways, and it requires experience just to say, okay, so what are it's a great point, Doug. I mean, what are the consequences for this individual to whom I'm talking via Zoom or across a table or by telephone? What are the consequences to this particular person? And there is an ethic that I think is very useful. With regard to sales, I think in human interaction in general, which is an ethic that comes from improvisational theater. One of the things about improvisational theater, one of the principles of improvisational theater is that your job as an improv actor is to make the other person look good.
Did not know that about improv. All right, so let's
everybody knows about like yes and. We're at an improv thing. You say something, I can't say no. I have to say yes and. All right, I have to say yes and. But my job is not to kind of delight the crowd. My job is to make you look good. Your job is to make me look good. So if you go in, and I think this is a good precept, especially for some of your younger sellers, how can you make this person look good? How is your selling this to John or Jane or Maria going to help John or Jane and Maria advance their careers? And I think if you think that way, which is sort of, I'm putting a finer point on what you're suggesting, I think that's a very healthy way to look, and it requires sophistication. It requires acute perspective taking. It requires a sense of human dynamics.
And I love the fact you brought improv up, Dan, because I always tell people that they're like, how are you so quick on your feet? Like that type of thing. It's like practice, right? You've got to go into improv classes and practice. And I can tell everybody from when I first started, somebody would, they used to go zip, zap, zoom, do things like that. And I'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, and I feel a little like that fish out of water or completely out of water. But that's part of the process that you're talking about. We have to cross now from the old way of doing to the new way of doing selling in order for us to thrive in the field of sales today. And certainly being able to curate the information and bring it down into its essence so they can filter through all the crazy stuff. Which in itself, I'm going to go to your second point, which is problem finding today, right? So if we can make something simple that seems overwhelming or complex, we found a problem for people and we can solve that problem for people. So when you're looking at problem finding, how do you recommend, and this may be an unfair question because we never talked about this, but how does one kind of like start to be a problem finder versus a problem solver in life?
There are a number of different specific techniques about this. One of them is also so I'll give you two. One of them is, and you can think of one as kind of horizontal and the other one is vertical. So the horizontal is talking to a lot of people in your industry. And actually, when you go on a sales call, or even something that is not officially a sales call, let's say you're selling to CTOs, and asking them, hey, what's going on? What are the biggest things that are bugging you? What was the most frustrating thing that happened to you this week? Asking those kinds of questions, just having a conversation before you're trying to sell something, and actually keeping a pretty good log of those kinds of things. That is not just chalking up to memory, but maybe putting it in your notes app on the phone or on a Word document or a Google Docs document or something like that. And then here's the interesting thing. You once you have an arsenal of those, you can go to on your next sales call to a CTO and say, hey, I've been talking to CTOs all month. You want to know what like the two biggest headaches that other CTOs face? Every prospect is going to say, hell yeah, I want to hear that.
Right. And
so that's and so you start to understand what's really going on out there. And and so that's the way sort of a broad spectrum of conversations can allow you to see things that the people who are enmeshed in it every day might not. The second thing is a much more tactical technique. And it's annoying. It comes from, the genesis of it is in question. A lot of people claim credit for it. I think that Toyota a lot of people claim credit for this thing. Toyota supposedly came up with it before some others, but it's called the 5 whys, which is when someone says what they need, you ask them why, and you follow up 5 times with that why. So you say, I need a new computer system. Why? Because the old one isn't working very well. Why? Because we've grown too far and we don't have the capacity in the old system. Or what is that? 3. Why? Well, we grew because we had this new market out there for X, Y, or Z. Why? Because and so you start drilling down like that, and you end up seeing things that the people themselves often don't see. Your listeners can go just put into your favorite search engine, the technique called the 5 whys, and it's a really interesting way to get to the heart of the problem, because usually what happens, especially in B2B, people don't know precisely what they need. They have a guess. And so, but if you ask them why they need that, and then ask them why to the next question and the next question and the next question, you can sometimes get to the heart of things that they weren't able to see themselves. And then you're really valuable.
That makes so much sense. And I'll bring that back to my children comment in the beginning, because children, that's what they ask, right? I mean, I know my 2 daughters would be like, Dad, why does this happen? Oh, because X, Y, Z. Well, okay, why does that happen? They would just keep asking and asking. And I think people, for some reason, through human conditioning or social conditioning, whatever it might be, they sort of like lose that touch with that curiosity factor. Because what I'm hearing is that's what we want to do. We want to go in and be a problem finder. We've got to get curious, not trying to position to sell at that process. And is it all to kind of create, like, I don't know, like thoughts in their head, like their statements? Like if you can get to that place, for example, we walk in at why, okay, what else? Why? And they're going, my gosh, I never thought of that. That kind of positions that person more as an expert, because they were bringing forth that information that person's now going, my God, I never thought like this. I mean, geez, maybe I should pay attention to Doug a little bit more or whatever, right? So did Toyota, I'm curious, because I know you might know more of the background of this, and did Toyota come up with this for like sales purposes, or what was the reason?
It's actually a technique also that designers use when they're trying to for things like product design. So I'm making this up. People don't like this toaster. Why? Because the slots are too small. Why? Because more people are having bagels than Wonder Bread. Why? Because there's much greater ethnic diversity in the United States than there ever was. Why? Because we changed the immigration laws. What we need is actually, so what we need now is not a toaster with more, wider things, but a toaster that actually appeals to a wider kind of demographic. I tell you, a toaster that isn't a white people's 1950s toaster, but a toaster built for multi-ethnic 2023 America. Again, I'm just making that up, but
sure.
but it's what designers do. So because people will come to you and present saying, okay, this toaster sucks because the slots are too small. And that's actually not what it is. It's basically you can find out. I'm totally making this up, so don't go off and like.
Everybody's researching toasters now.
I'm sort of it's logical, I think, but I'm doing it. I'm sort of doing it off the top of my head. So if you go in there and saying the way to make a better toaster is to widen the slots, you're missing the point. The way to make a better toaster is to recognize that most toasters were made for a certain kind of American in a certain kind of family. And that kind of American, that kind of family exists less and less and less. So you want a toaster that serves modern America, not 1950s Leave It to Beaver America. So and so if you're a designer, then it's like, oh my God, this is such an interesting problem. We can do something amazing. We can do something totally cool, rather than simply, oh, what can we do to increase the width of the slots?
That makes so much sense. So I have one other question for you. So you wrote a book, and if I remember correctly, A Whole New Mind. It was called A Whole New Mind, right? And I remember Oprah Winfrey, if I remember correctly, gave like 4,500 copies of this away, or whatever the number was, a lot of copies to, I think it was Stanford, when she did a university speech. And I was looking at the book and I was like, it's a battle between the right brain and the left brain in a lot of ways. That's kind of what but more right brain creativity now is sort of prevailing through.
I don't want to use the metaphor of battle. I want to use the metaphor of a dance. It's a dance between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And the idea of that book is that, and again, AI is going to make some of that argument obsolete. Yeah. The kind of AI that is at our fingertips in literally the last few months is changing that a bit. But essentially what it is the argument is this, is that in many kinds of white collar jobs, the skills that were most valuable were skills that were characteristic of the left brain: logical, linear, sequential, analytical, step-by-step, basically SAT spreadsheet skills. And the argument is that today, those SAT spreadsheet skills are still necessary, but they're no longer sufficient because they're so easy to automate, and you're connected to people around the world who are willing to do that kind of work for a fraction of the cost. So what that means is that there's a greater premium on right brain skills: artistry, empathy, inventiveness, big picture thinking. And so that's the argument of that book. Now, if you look at generative AI, I think it's just pushing things even more, where the skills that are going to be most necessary are going to be skills essentially, basically, asking good questions and composing. Right. And that might be it. Well, and finding some meaning in your life.
Well, the reason I brought this up is because from a selling perspective, so many people think that, a great salesperson is just total right brain. They're creative and they're off the charts and all this stuff, right? And I've had this argument for decades. So it's like, you got to have both.
Absolutely.
Right? You really got to have both. So if you're creative, right brained, and you're a little bit scattered on the process and the systems and things, firstly, you're going to miss a huge part of an audience that they make buying decisions from that frame, because they think more like engineers or accountants or, just process-driven people. My wife's like this. She's a math major, right? I mean, she's got a master's in mathematics. Everything she puts into a logical format. So I've had to learn to communicate with her on that level. And what I teach people is you must communicate with the buyer on their level.
Yeah.
And I just thought the book was so great between the conversations going back and forth that I think people should read it, because it will allow them to kind of think a little more broadly in their approach to when they're selling to people, to remember that different people have different methodologies to their thoughts, A, when they're shopping, and B, when they're making a decision. And we've got to be able to switch between those two to go back to what you were talking about, the content creation, and being able to bring it down and present it in a way they can understand it.
Amen. I mean, this is what you're talking about is what I describe in the book, the To Sell Is Human book, as attunement. Can you get it in your own head, see things from someone else's point of view, use their language, not use their language, not yours, connect with them at both an emotional and an intellectual level. Hugely important.
Well, Dan, I really appreciate you being on the Sales Strategies podcast. I'm sure people are going, okay, this guy's really smart. I want to learn more about him. maybe get some things that he's done or some information, how do they get a hold of either that information or yourself?
You can go to my website, which is danpink.com, danpink.com. We've got a lot of free resources. We've got a free newsletter. There's information on all the books, all kinds of things, dancing unicorns, snowmobiles, all kinds of things.
It's a really great website, folks. If you haven't checked it out, please go do that. I've done that, and I love the website. So thanks again for being here, Dan.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. So what about becoming a curator of information now? And what about being a problem finder versus a problem solver? So important that, to understand that the old way of selling is not dead, but it's just less effective. And so what we want to do is we want to create the new way of selling, which is how do you get the content creation and simplify it down for people? How do you find problems? And what process do you use to do that? And if you focus on those two, just if you got nothing else out of this podcast episode, focus on those two things. Those two things are so important because what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the buyer to go, I didn't know that. Man, you seem more like an expert than my competitors, your competitors that are coming through here. So when you can get that to happen, that now doesn't just differentiate you, it makes you different. And so if you got to see a competitors, which most businesses now do, you want to be able to stand out from the crowd so that they go, okay, this person makes sense for me to talk with because they've done a lot of research on you prior too. So if you love this episode, what I would like to ask of you is go give it a 5-star review. I know it takes a few minutes to do that, but I'd be forever grateful. And share this with other people. The more you can share this with other people, the more people can, help. And, I always find this is a noble way of actually helping people. I find great information for people and I share it. Not just myself or my own content, but other people's contents, because, we're a collective world of brains. And when we use it, collectively, we create sort of a mastermind component of that. So if you would share that, if you're an expert on a subject matter that relates to selling in general, how to be in the top 1% of earners, or anything around that, then reach out to us at YouMatter at ceosalesstrategies.com. That is YOUMATTER at ceosalesstrategies.com. If you like a copy of the new ebook that I just put out, which is called The Nonstop 1% Earner, just go to this URL here, www.ceosalesstrategies.com/1PE. So ceosalesstrategies.com/1% earner. It's 1PE. As always, appreciate you being here. If you want to be part of our 1% Academy, which is teaching you how to think, act, and be, if you want to be a 1% earner through selling, reach out to us again at YouMatter at ceosalesstrategies.com. Until next time, go out and sell something. Sell a lot of it. Sell a lot of it, but play win-win and sell at profitability, it has a profit to yourself. In other words, play win-win with yourself in all cases. Make sure they win. Make sure you win. It is the strongest sale for you and for them to develop a relationship. And guess what? They'll appreciate that as well. And that's how you spark more referrals and more internal and external expansion of your sales process through your same relationship. Number 1 turns into number 5 or number 10 different relationships. This is Doug C. Brown with the CEO Sales Strategies Podcast. Again, go out and sell something, play win-win, and make it a great day. Until next time, to your success.